World War on the Western Front was characterized by the predominance of the defensive. Barbed wire, trenches, and devastating firepower in the form of both machine guns and artillery made offensive operations extremely costly, with ground gained measured not in miles but in meters. However, as quickly as defensive positions were being established by late 1914, the Germans, French and British were casting about for methods to resume the offensive. Although this took several years to come to effective fruition, one of the primary tools developed has become one of the iconic symbols of modern combat, the tank. In this video we will discuss the origins of one of modern warfare's most iconic combat vehicles in the Great War. Welcome to the story of the tank and its emergence onto the battlefields of Europe. Once you know how the tank came to be, instruct your engineers to bring it onto the battlefield for your own use in today's sponsor, Supremacy 1914. It's a game where tense, slow-paced World War I battles play out over weeks, and you're tasked with battling or allying with up to 500 other players to establish your chosen nation's supremacy. You'll be doing real diplomacy with the other players, but also you'll be researching tech like the tanks we'll be discussing today. One way or another, you'll have to get the advantage over your rivals, and perhaps keep it a secret. You'll also have machine guns, cavalry and planes to employ in your strategy, so plan well to make good use of them all. A really nice feature is that you can play on both mobile and PC to update your real-time plans whenever you need to. Play for free by downloading the game via our link in the description, and you'll also get an exclusive gift, 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. But it's only available for 30 days, so get it right now. The concept of an armoured combat vehicle was not new by the time of the First World War. Experiments with applying armour plating to cars were being conducted as early as the Boer War, the result of advances in how armour plating was being tempered, making it stronger and lighter. Advances in the internal combustion engine also provided a better, more efficient and sufficiently powerful power source over steam engines that were bulky, labour-intensive and dangerous if damaged. Tractors using a continuous track for propulsion had also made great advances over the preceding decades, demonstrating that heavy loads could be moved through a variety of terrains. The combined existence of these three things by the time of the First World War meant that their combination just needed to be figured out. At the outbreak of war, although mechanization was heavily focused within the Service Corps, the Royal Navy Air Service led the way in armoured car use, as they were using them to conduct reconnaissance on poor weather days when their aircraft could not fly. Some of these vehicles were even fit with small naval guns, but as the mobile warfare of 1914 ground to a halt by the end of the year, the ability of the RNAS to scout by land was made obsolete, and the role of the armoured car seemed to fall to the wayside. It was at this time that the first Lord of the Admiralty stepped in, based on a paper written by Colonel Ernest Swinton and Maurice Hankey, who proposed adapting a steam-driven roller fitted with a machine gun into an armoured vehicle that could cut through wire, allowing infantry to advance. The idea had gained little traction, much like the roller itself that tended to simply spin uselessly in rough terrain. But the First Lord, one Winston Churchill, saw some merit in the idea, and in February of 1915, the Admiralty Land Ship Committee was formed to explore designs for an armoured combat vehicle. However, this job was complicated by a lack of clarity over what the vehicle was intended to do. Was it meant to attack, to clear a path through the wire for the infantry to advance, or was it to be a transport for infantry or supplies? Each of these functions would necessitate different features and designs. By July of 1915, the Admiralty was beginning to lose interest in the project, but fortunately it had gained some support within the War Office, and responsibility for development was transferred to the Trench Warfare Department. In order to ensure continuity, however, it was agreed that the Admiralty's staff and researchers would remain in place until production on the vehicle had actually begun. Importantly, it was at this time that it was decided that the vehicle would be designed for a combat role rather than as a transport unit. This decision meant that design work could begin in earnest. Tractors using Caterpillar treads that had been purchased from the United States served as the basis for work. But initial designs suffered issues with the tracks either not being able to bear the necessary weight of the armoured box, or sagging when crossing obstacles like trenches. While a solution was developed for these, it required the removal of the suspension system. What came from this was the prototype Little Willie, weighing in at 16 tons with a maximum speed of 2 miles per hour and armed with a Vickers 2-pounder in a turret. It was powered by a 105 horsepower Foster Daimler Knight engine. Although Little Willie was not fitted with tempered steel, the design called for a 10mm plate for production. Steering was to be aided by a wheeled carriage attached to the back. Working conditions inside the vehicle were hot and noisy, with dangers being presented by open machinery and fumes from poor ventilation. Although Little Willie was the first fully completed prototype, a major redesign was undertaken, resulting in a very different looking vehicle. A rhomboid track pattern was adopted, with the tracks running around the vehicle. Additionally, the turret was abandoned in favour of 6-pounder guns fitted into sponsons on the sides of the vehicle. The resulting product, nicknamed Caterpillar and then eventually Mother, conducted her first official tests in January 1916, and were deemed successful enough that further tests and demonstrations for staff and dignitaries, including King George V, were held in February. At this time, the term tank begins to appear, derived from attempts to conceal the nature of the project from potential spies by presenting it as a water carrier or a water tank. Based on the February 1916 demonstrations, 100 tanks were ordered to outfit the newly created tank detachment under the command of Ernest Swinton. The unit was quickly renamed the Armoured Car Section of the Motor Machine Gun Service. This was a seemingly natural position to place the new vehicle, as it could take advantage of the mechanical expertise that was already present in the unit. By May 1916, the name was changed again to Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps, and the initial order of 100 units was increased to 150 units, with 75 to be armed with 6-pounder guns and the other 75 to be fitted with machine guns. The former were commonly referred to as male tanks, while the machine gun-only models were referred to as female. Training began on grounds near Elverdon in Suffolk, and although Swinton had created a tactical guide on how he best envisioned the tank to be employed, it was largely ignored. Ironically, the ideas in the guide were very similar to how the tank would come to be used, but they were lessons that would be learned from combat instead. Gunnery training was conducted by the Royal Navy, and was rarely done in the tank itself, providing a poor recreation of what would be encountered on the battlefield. With only about 2 months of training on these new vehicles, units began to be shipped to France in August of 1916, with British generals eager or desperate to provide a new tool to win the faltering Somme offensive. On the 15th of September, the tank entered combat for the first time, being deployed in the British attempt to advance during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. The role assigned to the Mark I tanks was to support the infantry by attacking enemy strongpoints as the infantry advanced. 49 tanks were dedicated to the attack, with 17 of those breaking down or getting stuck before reaching their jumping-off point. Of the 32 remaining tanks that took part at Flers, 9 fell behind the infantry and could not participate, 9 broke down during combat, and 5 became stranded in trenches or shell holes, making them unavailable. The remaining 9 units, however, did well, maintaining their positions with the infantry and engaging targets as necessary. Overall, 17 of the tanks were hit by shells, with 10 being unrecoverable over the short term. The German reaction to the appearance of this new weapon was widely reported in Britain as being shock and fear, with troops fleeing as the tanks advanced. This, however, is likely a good piece of propaganda work, as the general German reaction has been found to be that while they did fall back, it was to reorganize in new defensive positions. The introduction of tank warfare received mixed assessments. JFC Fuller deemed that the debut was not particularly successful, but that it did show promise. Maintenance and reliability issues were a concern, as evidenced by the number of tanks which had failed to even reach the field of combat. General Haig, on the other hand, was well pleased with the new tool at his disposal and placed a new order for 1,000 new tanks. Although the British had achieved a combat-ready tank first, they were not the only nation working on a tracked armoured vehicle. Like the British, the French were similarly working on the concept, using tractors with continuous treads as their starting point. The French army experimented with remote control tracked vehicles laden with explosives to try and clear barbed wire, and this concept evolved into the Cuirass terrestre, the land battleship, envisioned to be armed with a 37mm gun, machine guns, and be capable of towing an armoured trailer carrying infantry. The project was championed by Jean-Baptiste Eugène Estienne, who presented the idea to General Joffre, who encouraged him to pursue the concept. Estienne contracted with Schneider to build 400 of the so-called Schneider CA-1 Char d'Assaut, a medium-weight assault vehicle. Although the first prototype of the Schneider was ready by March of 1916, upgunned to a 75mm gun, it took until September to begin the first deliveries, and even then, only 8 vehicles had been delivered by November, when the contract had originally been planned to be complete. Further delays occurred when General Nivelle replaced Joffre in December of 1916. The Schneider CA-1 first saw combat during the Nivelle offensive of May 1917, and although it saw some limited successes, it was largely deemed ineffective due to being underpowered. The same conclusion was found in France's other heavy tank attempt of the First World War, the Saint-Chamond, which used an electric drive system. The Saint-Chamond was not only expensive to build, but had a tendency to bog down due to its weight. Back in Britain, the Mark I tank was being used as a model, with variations being proposed in order to improve its functionality. This included moving the fuel tanks from inside the front of the vehicle to an armoured enclosure on the back of the vehicle, and including an unditching beam to assist the tank in extracting itself from mud. On top of some design changes made to enable easier rail transport of the tanks, these improvements became the basis for the Mark IV tank. However, the Mark IV was not available in sufficient quantities for the next Allied offensive. The Battle of Arras in April of 1917 saw some limited tank use, largely Mark I and Mark II training tanks, although poor weather held back their full employment. Tactically, although they were still used to support infantry against strongpoints, there was much better preparation than had been in place at Flers. Time was spent before the battle conducting reconnaissance and assigning rally points for the vehicles in hopes of better coordination. Fundamentally though, the Mark I tanks still suffered from reliability issues, and the infantry that they were supposed to support had poor confidence in the ability of the tanks to provide assistance when needed. Interestingly, the German army captured several Mark II training tanks near the village of Bullecourt, and not knowing that the training tanks did not use hardened armour, determined that tank use was not a good use of resources. This likely helped to stunt Germany's own tank development program. The Mark IV began arriving in France from May 1917 onwards, with crews being sent for extensive training. At the end of July, the Tank Corps was created, a growing sign of the importance and maturity that armour was taking on in the British Army. Planning for the next British offensive proceeded apace and was to be reliant on massed tanks as part of the assault. Unfortunately, there remained a disconnect between the planners' expectations and the realities of the tank's capabilities to deal with the mud of Flanders during the Third Battle of Ypres in the autumn of 1917. More promising, however, was a planned attack in November in the Cambrai salient. The chalky ground of the region meant much better drainage and generally better conditions for tanks to operate in. The attack was planned as a tank battle, with a heavy concentration of Mark IV tanks, which infantry would then support to exploit any breakthroughs. Additionally, there was to be no preliminary artillery bombardment in order to maintain the integrity of the battlefield and minimize any broken ground in which the tanks could get stuck. As part of the planning, tanks were fitted with fascines, large bundles of wood, which could be dropped into trenches to allow the tanks to cross. On November 20th, the first day of the Battle of Cambrai saw large gains by the Allied attack, spearheaded by the tanks, which easily passed through the German wire and trenches. However, by the second day, the pace of advance was considerably slowed, the result of mechanical issues which continued to plague the Mark IV tanks. Strong German counterattacks resulted in little overall ground being gained. What Cambrai demonstrated, however, was that a concentrated tank force, working with air cover, infantry and artillery support, as well as the element of surprise, could be used to breach enemy lines. Throughout 1917, the British and the French worked on a different variation of the tank, the light tank. The results from these experiments were the Whippet for the British and the Renault FT for the French. At over 14 tons, the Whippet had a top speed of over 8 miles per hour and was armed with 4 Hotchkiss machine guns. It was designed to move quickly to exploit gaps in the lines created by the heavy tanks. The Renault FT was smaller than the Whippet at only 6.5 tons, with a top speed of 4.3 miles per hour, but was inexpensive and easy to build. Estienne planned to counter German artillery capability with sheer volume, comparing tactics to that of a swarm of bees. Its lighter weight allowed it to maneuver over terrain where the heavy tanks would get stuck. The Renault FT is often considered the most successful tank of the First World War, with over 3,000 units being built and used around the world, even forming the core of the future American tank force. The Kaiserschlatt of the spring of 1918 saw Allied tanks of all models being used to blunt the German offensive, and it wasn't until August and the Battle of Amiens that saw tanks resume the offensive. By this point in the war, the role of the tank was becoming much more effective as a result of the lessons learned in the 2 years since the weapon's first introduction to combat at Flers. The Mark V tank had been introduced to service with a more powerful and, crucially, more reliable engine. Coordination and trust with supporting infantry had been established, as well as with artillery, although coordination with supporting air cover remained elusive. Amiens saw over 600 tanks, including support vehicles, massed, and the first day of the battle witnessed huge gains for the British and French. However, by the 4th day of the battle, the number of tanks still able to conduct offensive operations had dwindled to near zero. But enough had been done to break open the trench lines and allow for a more mobile offense, eventually leading to the armistice only a few months later. Tank development continued through 1918, with the Mark V Star model being developed, with longer tracks to assist in crossing widened trenches, and the Mark VII, which used hydraulic drive and steering, and provided better ventilation for the crew. A Mark VIII tank was in the works, as well as a joint Anglo-American venture, and would have been built around a 300 horsepower V12 engine, and enough space to move infantry on the battlefield. The Whippet was set to be replaced by the Medium B, a machine gun medium tank, which itself was set to be replaced by the Medium C, which was claimed to be the best tank of the war, despite the fact it never saw any actual combat. It is undeniable that the tank has had a tremendous impact on the nature of modern warfare. In the relatively short period of only 2 years, the vehicle went from a general idea without a defined purpose to having an impact so great that some believe it was responsible for winning the First World War. It is this writer's opinion that this is too bold a belief, and that the tank was only as successful as it was because tactics were developed to coordinate the actions of the vehicle with the other combat services to not only break through enemy lines, but be able to advance and hold that ground. This lesson has been evident time and time again throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, from the battles of the Second World War to those in the Middle East, and even in present-day Ukraine. The tank is a valuable weapon, but one that works best in concert with its army. Thanks to our sponsor, the free online PvP World War I strategy game, Supremacy 1914. Lead a campaign of epic battles, diplomacy, trade and technology to take over the world as your chosen state. Click the link in the description to get the game with an exclusive gift, 15,000 gold and 1 month of free premium subscription, but only for the next 30 days, so act fast. More videos on the evolution of modern warfare are on the way. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.